Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. In recovering from the inflation 70s, President Ronald Reagan slashed regulations and taxes. This highly controversial approach launched the U.S. on a trajectory of economic growth, wealth creation, and increasing standards of living. President Donald Trump took the same approach, which also began yielding quite significant improvements before COVID-19 almost completely shut down the U.S. economy and global economies. During the Biden administration, the approach regarding increasing regulations has become unprecedented. It is not my intent to dispute in this session any of the regulations, but rather to discuss the economic impacts and costs that come with them. Even if you fully support them, they're not free. Too many of them quite literally stall an economy and force increased fiscal deficit spending levels to counteract their impact. As such, I want to discuss the subjects outlined here. Though the mainstream media does little to even raise the awareness, economists, corporations, and policy think tanks are screaming about the onslaught, an onslaught that has been steadily accelerating. As examples, the Congressional House Committee in April issued a report that highlighted that Biden's regulations were costing nearly $1.4 trillion. The National Association of Manufacturers also recently issued a report highlighting that the U.S. federal government regulations cost an estimated $3 trillion, that is in 2023 dollars, an amount equal to 12% of the U.S. GDP. That was $12,800 per employee per year in 2022. According to their study, small firms under 50 employees incur regulatory costs of approximately $14,700 per employee per year, 20% greater than the cost per employee in large firms at $12,200 per employee. Amplified greatly in the manufacturing sector, being $50,100 versus $24,800 per employee in other sectors. Even the National Bureau of Economic Research has recently reported that the average firm is now spending 1.34% of its total labor costs on performing regulations-related tasks, and that's according to the government's own National Bureau. A Cato research report recently showed that the average U.S. firm spend between 1.3%, which the government had claimed, and 3.3% of its total wage bill on regulatory compliance. Obviously, inflation, associated global supply chain realignments, and finding skilled workers are affecting business, but federal regulations are surging and nearly as impactful as the others. This year's thesis paper, entitled The Regulatory State, outlined the growing size and role big governments was increasingly taking in our lives. The U.S. is becoming a country of bloated government. What we didn't cover in the thesis paper is what the regulations they are increasingly producing is actually costing us. The list is long, but includes examples such as emission standards. These standards are projected to cost some $870 billion per year and will raise prices for families already dealing with the impact of inflation. Beneficial ownership reporting requirements for businesses is expected to cost $84 billion. Drinking water regulations, $63.4 billion. Transparency, that is new staffing and transparency requirements for Medicare and Medicaid, over $43 billion. Automobile regulations. A 2021 study published by Cambridge University found that auto regulations have added around $6,000 to $7,000 in cost per vehicle over the long term. Similarly, a Heritage Foundation report from 2016 found that President Obama's fuel economy standards would raise prices for consumers by at least $3,800 per vehicle. Household appliances, another broad subject. The Biden administration has unveiled a series of new regulations aimed at household appliances. An analysis by the Alliance for Consumers estimated that Biden's new standards for washing machines will increase per unit prices by $200, and new gas furnaces efficiency standards will cost consumers just under $500 on average. Biden's ban on certain refrigerants will increase the cost of refilling air conditioning units by over $1,000. The bureaucratic red tape just goes on, but these are just examples of the costs that are just increasingly being built into our system almost on a daily basis with everything we pass. While the rate of growth of private sector job creation fell after the initial rebound from COVID, government job growth rate is steadily rising. Not only are new government jobs on the rise, but wages and benefits for them, such as pension plans, are growing much faster than the public sector. If you aren't living off the government transfer payments, then you're better off working for them, whether at the federal, state, or local level, which is a whole study in itself on the rate of growth when you combine all of them. And it appears we are only at the beginning of what may be and actually ahead of us as we keep this bloated government growing. What all these people do is create, administer, and police compliance to regulations, rules, laws, policies, standards, and requirements. What we are witnessing is exploding bureaucratic overreach. I encourage you to read the latest report out by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. It is 143 pages of facts on the growth of new regulations, rules, and requirements. It is well labeled as the 10,000 Commandments. The report details annual costs of just under $2 trillion in 2023 being spent on regulations and government intervention. It includes economic regulations of approximately $400 billion, tax compliance of $316 billion, environmental kinds of rules at over $400 billion, and a raft of other areas. During calendar year 2022, while agencies issued 3,168 rules, Congress enacted 247 laws. Thus, agencies issued 13 rules for every law enacted by Congress. The unconstitutional index, the ratio of regulations issued by agencies to laws passed by Congress and signed by the President, highlights the entrenched delegation of lawmaking power to actually unelected agency officials. The average ratio over the past 10 years is 22 rules for every law. Since January 2021, the Biden administration finalized 923 federal rules costing $1.6 trillion. The Biden administration finalized regulations imposing costs of over $1 trillion in just the last few months as agencies rush to protect their regulatory actions from possible rollback measures in the event that Biden loses the 2024 election. Biden issued just 29 executive orders in 2022 after issuing 77 in 2021. This reduction actually reflects a change in strategy rather than a more modest view of executive power. Biden's memoranda continues to outstrip recent predecessors, as these typically escape formal review. U.S. households pay $14,514 annually on average in hidden regulatory tax. This amount exceeds every item in the household budget except housing. A typical American household spends more on embedded regulations than on health care, food, transportation, entertainment, apparel, services, or savings. When regulatory costs are combined with federal outlays of $6.27 trillion, the federal government's share of the entire economy reaches 31.4%. State and local spending and regulations would add to these costs even further. The Congressional Budget Office on February 15, 2023, Budget and Economic Outlook, covering fiscal year 2022 and projections for 23 and 2033, showed discretionary, entitlement, and interest spending of $6.2 trillion in fiscal year 22, with spending projected to top $7 trillion in 26 and hit nearly $10 trillion by 33. Unprecedented open-ended deficits, now standing at $1.4 trillion annually, are expected to top $2 trillion annually by 2030. The national debt now tops $34 trillion, up almost $20 trillion as late as 2017. Of 99,429 final rules issued since the Congressional Review Act passed in 1996 during the Clinton administration, just 20 rules have been ever revoked, including one guidance document. Economically significant regulations are a special category of significant regulations. These rules each have at least $100 million of economic impact. The Biden administration's spring and fall 2022 editions of the Unified Agenda contained a combined of 89, compared with 105 and 21, completely economically significant rules. Even taking the dip into account, Biden's count of completely economically significant rules is higher than anything seen in the Bush, Obama, and Trump years. We see a massive amount of growth in bureaucratic overreach. But what about the actual costs of the regulations? According to the House Budget Committee report on April 24th of this year, and I quote them, Biden's burdensome regulations, along with his tax hikes and unbridled spending, are fueling the cost of a living crisis under which working Americans are suffering. End of quote. Again, I quote, President Biden is on track to impose more regulatory costs on our economy than any president in history, adding $1.4 trillion since coming into office. This is a staggering 45 times the regular costs accumulated under President Trump and almost 5 times at regulatory costs added under President Obama. I further quote the committee, cutting Washington's wasteful spending and reducing taxes and regulations will spur economic growth and reduce our unsustainable deficits. The most costly of President Biden's regulations was the Environmental Protection Act, so the EPA tailpipe vehicle emissions rule, which came in at $870 billion just by itself. President Biden increased his regulatory by $875 billion in just 1 week. That nearly matches the $890 billion total of President Obama's regulations during his entire presidency. The average cost of one of Biden's regulations is over $1.5 billion. In comparison, the regulations under Obama averaged $250 million. A concerned National Association of Manufacturers recently put out a major report entitled The Cost of Federal Regulation to the U.S. Economy. You can see that people are just screaming. They outline how the U.S. federal government regulations cost an estimated $3.1 trillion in 2022, an amount equal to 12% of the U.S. GDP, a little less than 3 times what the Government Budget Committee is even saying. This is significantly larger than government accounting. These costs fall unevenly on the major sectors of the economy and on firms of different size. The findings indicate that compliance costs fall disproportionately on small businesses, the creator of jobs in America. Federal regulations cost an estimated $12,800 per employee per year in 2022, according to the National Association of Manufacturers' very detailed study. Small firms with fewer than 50 employees incur regulatory costs, they feel, of $14,700 per employee per year, 20% greater than the cost per employee in large firms at $12,200. The regulatory cost advantage confronting small firms is amplified greatly in the manufacturing sector, with small manufacturing firms bearing more than double the cost of large manufacturing firms, just over $50,000 versus $24,800 per employee. Overall, small manufacturers incur regulatory costs that are more than 3 times the cost borne by the average U.S. company. Medium and large manufacturers in the United States face regulatory costs that are double the cost borne by the average U.S. firms. If we're going to bring jobs back or onshore them again, these are going to stand in the way of companies who are not even paying anywhere near this in other countries. We can't be increasing. We've got to do something about this if that is even going to begin to work in fixing global supply chains exposure that the U.S. faces. Separate research from the Cato Institute and the Housing Budget Committee points out other costs that are even being overlooked from these, but increasingly are becoming costly because of the complexity, vagrancies, and sheer number of rules and regulations. More companies have to hire outside specialists now and contractors simply to ensure compliance. This is killing smaller companies who can ill afford these costs. I have chronicled in my weekly newsletters the direct feedback I personally received from frustrated small business owners, having worked a 12-hour day, then going home to spend time at night reviewing mandated government educational videos on subjects that they feel the government has no business requesting of them or their employees regarding reporting on the activities of their clients or customers. As one angrily told me, I'm not the police. I have no proof and could not get sued by my clients if I did what the government is asking. However, they're told they must comply or there will be penalties. The House Budget Committee points out that the regulatory expense can range from the cost of hiring compliance officers, investing in compliance software, and training staff to the final penalties incurred for noncompliance. The Cato research points out that data on the occupational task and firms' wage spending finds that the average U.S. firm spends between 1.3 and 3.3% of its total wage bill on regulatory compliance. Almost 94% of the compliance costs in the U.S. financial sector are labor-related and 3.3% are equipment-related. Survey estimates in 2014 show that 68.4% of compliance costs in the U.S. manufacturing sector are labor-related and 13.4% equipment-related. An average firm spends 3.3% of its total labor costs on performing regulated tasks per year. Using our most conservative measure, the average is 1.34%. Our research shows that regulatory compliance costs of U.S. businesses have grown by about 1% each year from 2002 to 2014 in real terms. The inclusion of firms' equipment expenditures related to compliance increases complexity costs by about 20%. The total wage bill devoted to regulatory compliance workers in 2014 was between $79 billion and $239 billion, depending on the stringency of the regulatory compliance measure, and up to $289 billion when equipment is included. What legislators and the regulatory state must fully understand that excess or poorly constructed regulations can negatively impact a country's competitive advantage. The appropriate goal of regulation is to enhance, not undermine, societal well-being. In other words, regulation should do more good than harm. Without a counterfactual, it is impossible to know what a more disciplined regulatory environment would have meant for economic growth and well-being. However, evidence suggests that a smarter regulatory approach targeting at problems that cannot be solved by other means could have enormous benefits for current and future generations. Regulations can obviously create barriers to entry, which can reduce competition and increase prices for consumers. These barriers can include startup costs, licensing procedures, regulatory compliance itself, expense, education, testing, and fees, and the list goes on, as you've seen. Regulations can create other challenges for companies, including timeliness, that is, regulations can change quickly, and companies may not be aware when new regulations come into effect. Cost. Companies can incur significant costs trying to simply monitor legislative changes. And the data, it can be burdensome for companies to stay up to date with the changes. Though difficult to measure, it is widely recognized that the quality and extent of government regulation is a major detriment to prosperity. The World Bank conducts annual doing business surveys measuring government policies and the ease of doing business in different countries. Over the last decade, the United States has dropped from number 4 to number 8 on the World Bank list. It's accelerating. The World Bank finds that the highest-ranked countries in its survey regulate, but they do it in a less costly and burdensome way, and they focus their efforts more on protecting property rights than governments in other countries. It observes a thriving private sector with new firms entering the market, creating jobs, and developing innovative products, contributes to a more prosperous society. Obviously, it promotes growth and expands opportunities for poor people. This is what the World Bank has documented. Empirical studies of deregulated industries in the U.S. demonstrate the impact of regulation on innovation. They consistently find that the deregulation enables greater innovation and larger price reductions than economists predicted based on pre-deregulation costs and market conditions. A few studies have attempted to quantify the effect of regulations on economic growth, productivity, and innovation. For example, in a classic analysis from the 1980s to simulate the long-term growth of U.S. economy with and without environment regulations, concluded that, and I quote them, the cost of environment regulations is a long-run reduction of 2.6% in the level of the U.S. gross national product. That was back in the 80s. They were already seeing this looming, built-in, hidden cost, weight, and burden. The good news is the Supreme Court recently overturned a 40-year precedent in a case brought by a New England fisherman the court reversed what's been known as the Chevron deference doctrine. In the 1984 case, the court said judges should generally defer to federal agencies when rules they make are reasonable, and the enabling law was ambiguous. It was a unit of the Commerce Department which forced the fishermen to pay the salaries and costs of having a federal overseer aboard their fishing boats that initiated the case being brought to the U.S. Supreme Court. This case is important in both administrative law and constitutional law. This is a sea change for what the courts do when they review agency actions, in this case, enforcement actions. The Supreme Court said it is really getting back to what the courts have always done and should do, and that is interpret the law and not leave that to U.S. government administrative agencies. It's going to wind up in more enforcement action being reversed by federal courts. The EPA lost in courts a few years ago on whether it actually has the statutory authority to regulate carbon and carbon dioxide, even though it seemed natural, but it wasn't really in the law. Same thing for the FDA to try to ban tobacco or cigarettes and so forth. They can regulate, but they can't ban it. The Supreme Court ruling is affecting the balance in two ways. One, it's between the agencies and the court, and the other, like the EPA case, is between the agencies and Congress. If the law that Congress has passed is clear, and the agencies take action based on that, but if you find that it is unclear, the Chevron two-step doctrine kicks in. It's going to be much, much harder for federal agents to invoke major, incredibly complex regulations that are clearly outside the original intent and scope of the governing statute. This ruling is long overdue to allow agencies to pick the pocket of the regulated without regulatory authorization. It's against all the principles of representative government and our constitutional structure, but that's what's been going on at an increasingly accelerated rate. Chevron encourages agencies and impartial judges to interpret the law, and sometimes those agencies are afflicted with institutional self-interest. It's a huge step, in my opinion, for self-government and dethrones federal agencies. This is a welcome decision by the court. It amounts to the justices telling the rest of the government, do your job and stay in your lane. Hopefully, what we'll see going forward is regulations that truly respect market forces and the beneficial effects of competition, do more good than harm, base decisions on best available information and transparency, gather better feedback, encourage experimentation and learning, regulatory humility, and address regulatory accumulation. When you're in a hurry, just passing these regulations, all of this is just bypassed, and that we need to have a much better cost analysis before anything is implemented. So what can we conclude? Though the Chevron deference ruling is extremely positive and does give us hope, the reality is regulations will increase as government grows, and there appears to be no sign of that happening. Unfortunately, until I personally see clear evidence to the contrary, I see the macro-prudential policies of financial repression being slowly expanded, but now in the form of regulatory repression. Will we choose reduced regulations or increasing regulatory repression? In this election year, we need to be reminded that elections have consequences. As I always remind you in these videos, remember politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take that money or it is simply of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They're for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there is actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not necessarily following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2024 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.